I'm Ron, and welcome to another episode of Ron's Library and Ideas. Now, the last time we were on here, I was reading to you from this book, The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X. And this is a brother that I don't think you could really know too much information about. So when we left off, if you saw the last lab, if you haven't, go check it out. But we were talking about a lynching that took place in Omaha, Nebraska. Basically, there was a YT lady who said she was assaulted along with her boyfriend by a black man. The black man held her boyfriend at gunpoint while he assaulted her. They found some guy that they said did it, but he had rheumatism, what they said. He was crippled himself. And they say he was the person who attacked that lady. So, I call BS on that. But, when you get a mob of people get, caught up in a frenzy, they'll do whatever. People aren't even thinking straight anymore. And that's not to let them off, but keep in mind when you see a mob of people doing something, they're usually not in their right minds or they're acting in a very unique way. So let's see. Again, we're going to be reading out of The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X. Uh-oh, let me see if I can find. I got to go a little bit earlier. Okay. Okay. So, when we last left off, it was a crowd of 200 schoolboys who started, well, let's get this Negro. But they didn't say Negro. And then in the frenzy, they were joined by like 10,000 people all outside of this jail wanting to pull this black man out and have their way with him. So let's continue. We are going to teach these Negroes a lesson, said one man. A local newspaper reported the crowd was estimated at 10,000 to 20,000 people, angry, mainly Caucasian immigrant men and women. It seemed as if all of white Omaha, save authorities, was united in this bloodthirsty pursuit of a Negro American citizen, innocent by every standard of a lawful society. So if you're just now tuning in, this lady, YT lady, was assaulted, and they put the blame on this black man. So now they have this black man in the jail, but that's not good enough for the crowd. The crowd is thinking, hey, that's not going to be good enough. Give them to us. The residents pillage nearby hardware stores and pawn shops, stealing more than 1,000 revolvers and shotguns, according to police records. As the sheriff and his deputies periodically dodged bullets themselves, the irate workers and idlers torched the lower floors of the courthouse with gasoline. So these people were thank you for tuning in. Hello. These people were so incensed that they were willing to burn down their own courthouse and shoot at the police officers. Now, they give black people a lot of gripe about us not liking the police. But if you look at the history of this country, there's a lot of YT people who don't like the police either. They only want them around in particular when it's to harass us. Inside the stately courthouse, Will Brown moaned to Sheriff Mike Clark, "I am innocent. I never did it. My God, I am innocent." The more reliable Morning World Herald told its readers. And a local reporter and attorney who interviewed Brown in jail agreed with a physical examination report that Brown was too twisted by rheumatism to assault anyone. And what's wild is that doesn't even matter. They know this man is crippled. that he has a disease, but to them, they just need somebody to kill. My opinion on the Epstein files. Well, I don't think Congress or our government will ever release all the files because they don't want that information coming out about them. Um, and I'm sure there's even more sick stuff in it that they don't want us to know. I saw Congress had a vote whether or not they were going to release the sexual assault records or the sexual misconduct records of people in Congress. And of course, they voted against that. I think there were 65 senators or congressmen who said, yeah, release it. But 100 and something said, no, let's keep that in the tuck. So yeah, that's something that we're probably never going to see. The white mob made clear its non-negotiable demand. Prisoner Brown was to be taken from the fifth floor jail cell and handed over to them. When Police Chief Marshall Eberstein failed to quell the crowd, Mayor Smith, whom the immigrants and the mob blamed for their labor discontent with Negroes, emerged from the flaming courthouse at about 11 that evening and pleaded for order. Someone hit Smith on the head with a baseball bat. Another man slipped the noose of a rope around the mayor's neck, and the crowd dragged him away. Several spectators wrested the mayor from his captors and placed him in a police automobile. So these people were so crazy that they're about to lynch their own mayor. And again, part of this trouble started, these are Irish immigrants mostly in this city who were upset that black people were coming in and taking jobs that they thought belonged to them. Within minutes, the crowd recaptured his victim, roped him once again, and managed nearly to suspend the body of Omaha's chief executive from a traffic signal tower. And we're reading from The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X. Dang, they were about to, they strung up the mayor of the town. That's wild. On the verge of strangulation, the dangling Mayor Smith was dramatically rescued by special agents driving through the throng in a high-powered automobile. They rushed the mayor to the hospital where, after 2 days on a critical list, he would recover. One not-so-lucky 16-year-old was shot dead while leading the gang to the fourth floor of the courthouse. A block away, James Heichel, a 34-year-old businessman, was shot dead by 2 stray bullets. Throughout the melee, Negroes were dragged from streetcars and beaten, while other such unsuspecting pedestrians were traced down on sight. Well-meaning whites attempting to render aid were themselves battered about. Meanwhile, the gasoline-fed flames lapped up the side of the 5-story building where policemen, court officers, and 121 prisoners had fled to the roof. Despite the cries for mercy, the mob blocked all attempts to hoist rescue ladders, and they severed water hoses that firemen hooked up to nearby hydrants. As the roof weakened under the heat, the women prisoners were allowed to depart the building. However, the men trapped by the inferno yelled through the billowing smoke for help as some of the married officers reportedly placed goodbye telephone calls to their wives and families. These people didn't give a damn. They said, all right, we'll let the woman out, but the rest of you, y'all about to burn unless y'all give us this black man. Bring Brown with you, shouted one man, and you can come down. The bloodthirsty mob had clearly regained its singular focus on the nigger. With human incineration a distinct possibility, trapped officials on the fourth floor tossed down 3 notes. The judge says he'll give up Negro Brown. He is in dungeon, one piece scrawled. There are 100 white prisoners on the roof. Save them, another note read. Come to the fourth floor of the building and we will hand the Negro over to you. Then, with automobile spotlights strained on the burning courthouse, 2 nimble young men with a shotgun and a coil of rope scaled the west wall to the fourth floor to the accompaniment of thunderous cheering, punctuated by a fusillade of shots. A mighty roar went up from the crowd with word that Will Brown had been captured, reported Omaha's Riot and Story and Picture, which was published that year by the Educational Publishing Company. This most destructive riot by the lawless white mob was reported in the journal as having been sparked by a boyish sense of mistaken chivalry. And in a mere 8-line paragraph, the pamphlet summarized what the mob did next to their Negro captive. According to newspaper accounts, some 11 hours past church services, the white rioters, still dressed in their Sunday fancy, proceeded to beat Will Brown bloody as he proclaimed his innocence. Shredding his clothes from his torso, they mercilessly whipped the near-naked Negro, who pleaded for his life as the mob cheered. Now think about that. These people fresh out of church, still in their Sunday best, and we're about to go and kill this man. I guess to them, he wasn't a fellow Christian. He wasn't a fellow man. He was an animal that they had to do something to. And think about the white people that got shot and killed as just mere, bystanders. And the ones attempting to help, they were beat. And I bring this up because, honestly, this wasn't that long ago. And it shows you the mindset of the people of the country at the time. And it's also something of note that this is the town in which Malcolm X was born. This was the type of environment that he was raised in. Let's see. The captive was then dragged to the higher 2 lampposts on the south side of the smoldering courthouse, where several immigrant attackers slid the knotted noose around the neck of this American citizen vaguely accused. Then, without so much as a rhetorical question about his guilt, they slung the cord over the arm of the pole and jerked the middle-aged, arthritic laborer off the ground. The abrupt snapping of live human vertebrae, a sound like no other, brought a blood-chilling hush upon the crowd. The limp body of Will Brown began to spin rapidly from the centripetal force of the hoisting. It steadied only when gunmen fired a volley of some 100 bullets into the rope torso. Excuse me. So it wasn't enough that he was dead. It wasn't enough that they hung him and snapped his neck. There was more they wanted to do to the body. So they shot it hundreds of times. I imagine the fear, the terror that Will Brown must have experienced, first being arrested and then being taken to the courthouse and a mob of like 10,000 people showing up, calling for your death. That's an experience like none other. I hope to never experience anything like that at the hands of a mob. The eerie scene moved the white mob to rapture. No other word seems appropriate. Whooping catcalls rang out like hosannas in a church revival, with the accompaniment of wild gunfire resounding through the smoke-filled Omaha Plaza the approach of midnight. In due course, a few raw-boned young men lowered Brown's stiff body on the taut rope and tied it to the rear bumper of an automobile. A driver gunned the engine, and what was left of the cadaver was driven through the wildly cheering throng of Omaha revelers, eager as hyenas at an antelope kill. At the intersection of Rampage, cluttered 17th and Dodge Streets, several of the men hustled up kerosene from nearby danger signal lamps used for street repairs. And in the autumn hush of midnight, a few pale, sweating attackers doused Brown's body on a wood pile with coal oil and set the corpse ablaze. So again, it wasn't enough to kill him. It wasn't enough to shoot his body with hundreds of bullets. It wasn't enough to drag the body behind a car. They had to set him on fire. Dozens of sporty youths in peaked caps and sweaters, along with church-going men in wool suits, neckties, and felt hats, swaggered around the killing ground, posing for photographs with the shredded body of their victim. Wide-eyed and eager, white residents of Omaha were photographed in full celebration of their naked human sacrifice roasting on an open pyre. The lynching of Will Brown was witnessed by one 14-year-old who will grow up to become a leading Hollywood actor, portraying quiet, quintessentially American heroes. His movie roles included young Mr. Lincoln, as well as the juror who saves a Latino man from an all-white jury's death sentence in 12 Angry Men. Henry Fonda recalled that as a teenager, he peered down at the handiwork of his neighbors that night from the second floor window of his father's printing shop. My hands were wet and there were tears in my eyes, the adult Fonda said of this incident of his childhood. Presumably, the youngster never left his perch for the hours-long lynching episode, reportedly standing the entire time alongside his father, William. When it was all over, we went home. All I could think of was that young black man dangling at the end of a rope. You know, what's interesting, not too long ago on X or Twitter, I saw the interview that this man did that was talking about that lynching that he saw in Omaha, Nebraska. His father brought him there, and I guess his father wanted him to see what human beings could be capable of in a mob. And wow, that's truly a horrible thing to do to another human being. And if you're just now tuning in, we are reading out of The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X. And you know, I wonder, the people who took part in that, did they go home and go straight to sleep? Did they go home and celebrate some more? I bet you they didn't even have any kind of problems falling asleep. Slept like a baby after mutilating a human being like that. By 3 a.m. on Monday, September 29th, federal troops of the 20th Infantry restored order by setting up machine gun and 1-pound cannon emplacements in the downtown business district and, as a precaution, in the Black Belt section of town. The troops were under the command of General Leonard Wood, who 2 decades earlier had led Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War and had been a contender for the Republican presidential nomination in 1916. Quote, "Omaha is not ashamed, but Omaha is frightened," end quote, wrote the New York Times, which reported that at least 2,000 Negroes have left the city by railroad. A headline that day in the Omaha Morning World Herald, which will win the 1920 Pulitzer Prize for its editorial, Law in the Jungle, read, "Frenzied thousands join an orgy of blood and fire. Crowds searched through streets attacking Negroes everywhere." Unlike some of the Red Summer riots or the lynching of Negroes in the South, the Omaha incident was complicated by the collateral loss of white lives and heavy damage to public property. Therefore, it could not be so easily dismissed by officials. Significantly, in the frenzy of seizing and torturing Will Brown, the largely immigrant mob had attacked local police and even the sitting mayor. Additionally, 2 white men were killed accidentally and 56 others injured, including policemen. The mob also wreaked about $750,000 in damage to the stately Douglas County Courthouse alone, including the loss of property records, tax lists, and other documents. This lawlessness against white residents and public property necessitated that judicial authorities prosecute or at least identify the more culpable transgressors among the largely immigrant crowd. Accordingly, under a federally authorized investigation, martial law authorities and police reports rounded up many of the mob leaders, totaling some 120 persons, and held them for trial in state court. Now, do y'all think anybody was actually charged with anything or found guilty? Let's see, because I don't. Of those indicted or jailed for the involvement in the riot, None reportedly served prison time. However, with the view of simultaneously serious thought and a possible probe into conditions that seem to foster anarchy, authorities commissioned an investigation that, as previously mentioned, was printed as a 20-page pamphlet. The psychologist will be interested in the mental reactions of the mob to the circumstantial stimuli, it noted. The layman will exercise a righteous curiosity in the hope of learning why law-abiding men and women become as wild beasts under the influence of the mob idea. That is fascinating to me that people can do such a thing. The Omaha police later verified that the kingpin of the local Irish crime syndicate, one Tom Pickhandle Dennison, had in several other instances paid whites in blackface to attack white women, not unlike Agnes Lobeck, in order to embarrass Mayor Smith in City Hall. In a subsequent grand jury report stated, several reported assaults on white women had actually been perpetrated by whites in blackface. The authorities all but specified that the reported attack on a white woman that sparked a ghastly lynching was probably staged by white men in blackface. Once again, a Negro had been set up as the scapegoat of cold-blooded white residents who considered themselves civilized, superior even. And except for the incontrivable fact of Will Brown's body having been incinerated at the center of the Omaha incident, no precise accounting was recorded of the damage wreaked upon black lives and property that hellish day and night. Nor was anyone ever convicted of the kidnapping, torture, brutal killing, and desecration of the victim, an innocent American victim. An innocent American citizen. What was left of Brown's body was buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field, while the interment log listed him as lynched. Grisly photographs of Brown's body roasting on the pyre were sold as postcards at the time, and rope used in his lynching reportedly fetched 10 cents of length as souvenirs. Such was the savagery of whites in Omaha and the barbarism in matters of justice for Negroes across America in the 1920s and well beyond. As was the national pattern, the open-ended mob lynching was dangled for years as a warning to migrated Negroes seeking jobs and justice on the Great Plains. And you know, they just found a young man hanging from a tree not too long ago. I believe this was in South Carolina, but the police said no foul play. So that was the 1920s. It is now 2026, just about 100 years later, and that sentiment really hasn't gone away. Y'all excuse me, I'm gonna grab some water right quick. Baby, you gonna be in my video? Oh, you all right? Okay. All right, my apologies, I'm back. I think it is important for us to have these stories and to pay attention to them because you must know what your ancestors have been through. You must know what your ancestors have done if you're on the other side of this. And don't let them make it seem like, oh, that was a long time ago. We've changed. It's not like this in the country anymore. Things have changed, but they haven't changed that much. You know, personally, my parents, schools weren't integrated in Savannah until they were in high school. So all before, they were in a segregated system. They were taught by all black teachers. And at least from an educational point of view, I think integration was a bad thing for us. Because let's see, my grandfather was an educator as well as my grandmother. And the mentality that they had was that these students coming up, this is our crop, and we need to do whatever we need to make sure that these students come out the best that they can be because they're going to contribute to our community. If you look up a list of black inventions and black inventors, a lot of that stuff happened before there was integration. Then you look at integration when that happened, and it seems like that list of inventions just sort of drops off. Because now we aren't being taught by people who look like us, who have our best interests at heart. Not to say that other races of people can't teach us and can't have our best interests at heart, but when it is your own people teaching you, you know that they have that passion and compassion there. All right, so let's continue on to this was just chapter 1 in this book. Let's continue on to chapter 2. This is called Storms of Racism. And I think this is important to lay the groundwork of just the foundation of what was happening around Malcolm X's family in the area he was going to be born into. And if you're just now tuning in, we are reading from The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X. All right, so chapter 2, Storms of Racism. The terror generated by the Omaha lynching, as well as hundreds of other atrocities, had the intended effect of creating an indelible sense of fear and anger that suffused the consciousness of virtually every Negro American during the 1920s. However, faced with death threats in the Deep South, where local sheriffs openly assisted white lynch mobs and where newspapers didn't consider such atrocities newsworthy, Negroes continued their great migration north by the tens of thousands. One of these Omaha job seekers was James Little, joined by his married brother, Oscar. And with the racist threat growing worse, they were joined in Nebraska by their rebellious brother, Earl, and his wife. Despite the racist terror in Omaha, Earl and Louise would insist upon establishing the chapter of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, in the city. Now, Earl and Louise, that's Malcolm's mother and father. Earlier in this book, they were describing Earl as a uppity nigga, and he had trouble being in Georgia. So he was trying to find a place for him and his new wife and family to live. So imagine, the courage it takes to come to a town like Omaha and to say we're going to establish the Universal Negro Improvement Association, a place that had just lynched a black man, and no one was held accountable for it. From this uncertain foundation on the Great Plains would spring a singular life that even now continues to give voice to people struggling for their human rights against powerful forces imbued with a false sense of white superiority. But to understand what brought forth this dynamic advocate for those conversely afflicted, often unknowingly by a false sense of black inferiority, it is necessary not only to examine young Malcolm's childhood environment, but also to detail relevant acts by white Americans that constituted barbarous, racist torts against Negro Americans of his day. Chief among these offenses was a daily violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, among other broken contracts with citizens not deemed free white males. So again, we have these pieces of paper that are amendments to the Constitution that says we're supposed to be treated equally under the law and have protection under the law. But in the 1920s America, this wasn't the case. And I can even make the argument even now in America in 2026, it's not equal justice under the law. I think we're all well aware enough of the fact that wealthy people and poor people, they go through a different type of criminal justice system. And don't be poor and black. Now you already have two strikes against you. Shortly before Reverend Earl Little and his wife Louise arrived in the city, native born white residents, as if envious of the European immigrants who staged the Omaha incident, invited the Ku Klux Klan to launch a local operation, according to an official of the Atlanta based group. It was not coincidental that the Klan was closed to Catholics and non Anglo European immigrants. Inspired nonetheless by Will Brown lynching, locals in early 1921 established Clavering Number 1, the first KKK unit in Nebraska on 41st and Farnham Streets. So that's something else that Omaha has a distinction of. The first Klan group was established in their city. Despite petty squabbles over political turf and internal rivalries, Omaha whites, both foreign and domestic, stood united in suppressing Negro citizens as a permanent underclass. So isn't that something? Uh, the immigrants and native whites, they didn't really get along, but one thing they had in common, excuse me, that they knew, well, we got to keep a foot on the necks of these black people. This kind of threat, the parents of baby Malcolm would know well and were determined to resist as UNIA organizers. A brief history of the Klan is useful to put into perspective the hooded knights of the 1920s who were sworn to keep blacks in their place. The white supremacist group was created immediately after the Civil War as an on-the-ground terror organization that helped officialdom deny Negroes the fulfillment of promises made in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, as well as those of the 1866 Civil Rights Act. The groups robed in hooded night riders, many of them bitterly arrayed as vanquished Confederate veterans, terrorized former slaves pursuing their constitutional rights as citizens. When the National Republican and Democratic parties beat back Reconstruction at the federal level, culminating with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877, which withdrew federal troops from the South and permitted Jim Crow laws to enshrine segregation and suppress Southern Negroes as second-class citizens, the Klan faded from prominence. In 1915, however, the White Knights were widely introduced to popular culture and eventually reintroduced to real life by director D.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of a Nation. Released on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, the silent film was based on the pro-Klan novel, The Klansman, and historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan by Thomas Dixon. The 3-hour film celebrates the Southern Confederacy, damns the Yankees, and renders Negroes as unspeakable hoodlums, political tyrants, and violators of white womanhood. You know, something that I just had a thought about. It definitely wasn't an accident that they released this movie, The Birth of a Nation, 50 years after the end of the Civil War. Bobby Hemmett taught me that periodically white supremacists will do things like this as a sort of a ritual to keep these ideas circulating in the minds of the people, to reinforce an idea. So them putting out a movie called The Birth of a Nation and then reintroducing the Ku Klux Klan to the vast majority of Americans, that's something that sparked another idea inside of the people, and it was also a way to instill more fear into black people. That was a ritual. Let's see. The 3-hour film celebrates, okay, I've already read that. It's something of an artistic foreshadowing of the real life staging of the reported sexual attack in the Will Brown lynching in Omaha, the hapless black villains in Griffin's movie are mainly white cast members in blackface. And the overall Klan message was made more lethal on film by the technical innovations of director Griffith and his attention to the minutest detail, which revolutionized the art of movie making. For example, there were 3,000 horses in the production, and a battery of 200 seamstresses labored for 2 months producing historically accurate costumes for 18,000 cast members. The movie had 18,000 people in it. And you know what? I bet you this started the idea that we can use Hollywood or we can use movies as a form of propaganda to promote ideas that we want to push to the people. You know, filmmaking is very effective and television is very effective at shaping the psyche of the masses of people. That's why we have to be very cognizant or aware of how we're portrayed in the media, because these ideas tend to stick. People see that and be like, okay, this is how black people are, or this is how white people are, or this is what a thug is, or these are the characteristics of a black woman, or the characteristics of a black man. And it's really just stereotypical stuff. That's them performing a ritual again to ingrain in your mind, this is how these people are supposed to act. So you really, I don't know, it's fascinating how that can really ingrain itself into the psyche of people and make them believe something that isn't really true. And again, if you're just now joining us, we're reading from The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X. Let's see. This Hollywood portrayal of the Klan as noble saviors of white America was so popular that President Wilson, a native Virginian with ingrained racist views, screened The Birth of a Nation in the White House. It was the first movie ever shown there in a political nod to Southern racist supporters. So think about that. The first movie that they showed in the White House was a racist film, The Birth of a Nation. Negroes across the country staged demonstrations against the film. William Monroe Trotter, a black journalist who a year earlier had been removed from Wilson's White House for protesting the president's segregation policies, waged an even more strenuous campaign against Griffin's film. But the Southern director's masterpiece, premiering to segregated audiences in Atlanta, aroused white racists to arms for miles around. Excuse me again. A notorious former Methodist preacher, one William J. Simmons, retreated to Stone Mountain, Georgia, with at least 15 other local firebrands, including the Speaker of the Georgia legislature. Simmons, the son of a physician who had been a leader of the original Alabama Klan of the 1860s, presided over a squad of men shivering before a burning cross of pine boards. They placed a Bible on a jutting rock altar, along with an American flag, a canteen of water, and a sword, over which they swore allegiance to wage an armed campaign against Negroes seeking rights as full citizens of the United States. So again, this is something that they're taking very seriously. During the night of fireworks on November 15th, 1915, this band of fierce and fearsome Georgians reconstituted the Ku Klux Klan as a secret organization of native-born Protestants, white, Gentile Americans. And for generations, the hooded white horsemen would crack down brutally on Negro progress with such terror methods as fire bombings, torture, abduction, castration, gang rape, and death by gunfire, drowning, and lynching. This revived group of self-described white supremacists expressed a stronger intolerance for Jews and Catholics than the original Klan. Despite its signature cross-burning ceremony, a visual innovation Hollywood gave the revised White Knights, and its armed night raids on the homes of unsuspecting residents, the secret Ku Klux Klan also operated in full daylight with faces unhidden. So they weren't even worried about getting in trouble for this. The reborn Klan became one of the most effective groups at influencing post-war American policy, campaigning vigorously, for example, for prohibition and against non-Anglo immigration from Europe. With its largest claverings outside the South in Indiana, Colorado, and Michigan, the national organization claimed a membership of some 3 million that included sheriffs, cops, district attorneys, mayors, and at least 2 sitting governors. Not to mention hundreds of thousands of women. So encompassing was its sectional appeal that it also enrolled one future Supreme Court Justice, Hugo Black of Alabama, who later described the Birmingham Clavern as a fraternal organization really, but quit after 2 years, according to some historians. Now, this is important to note that the Klan included such a wide variety of people in positions of authority in the country. And let's divorce ourselves from the idea that, well, the women weren't as bad as the men. The book just told you it was thousands of women who were members of the Klan as well. And if you think back to slavery, they often said it was the white female slave owner who was even more vicious than her husband. Let's see. According to some historians, the Klan even attracted a subsequent U.S. president, Harry S. Truman, who, as a candidate for office in Jackson County, Missouri, reportedly sought Klan backing but asked for his Klan dues back when ordered not to appoint Catholics to government positions. At the height of its political power, the Klan flexed its muscle with some 40,000 white-robed men and women, waved American flags, and proudly paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue in the nation's capital as onlookers cheered on August 8, 1925. A few months after local KKK vigilantes had terrorized Malcolm's pregnant mother, Louise. Upon arriving in Omaha on the heels of the Brown lynching and months after the formation of the Omaha Clavern, Reverend Little landed an industry job and settled in initially with the Smiley family on the Negro side of town. Soon after, Louise gave birth to daughter Hilda on October 22, 1921. Then son Filbert 18 months later. Scars of the Omaha incident were still visible downtown and at barbershops, hairdressers, social clubs, and family gatherings. The Little family heard neighbors talk warily about how the Brown lynching had totally disrupted their lives. As if that were not terror enough, local Negroes now faced the better armed and organized menace of homegrown white racist Klansmen. Straight away, Clavern #1 launched separate youth branches for boys and girls and a Women of the Klan auxiliary that expanded its Omaha rolls to 1,100, according to the Monitor. In due course, Klan officials would claim a statewide tally of 45,000 members of every age, gender, and social class who regularly mounted street demonstrations, weekend parades, and cross-burning ceremonies in open fields. Early on, local whites branded Reverend Little and his wife as troublemakers, in part because they had established a UNIA chapter. When a Klan letter was posted in the Monitor, Louise and her husband got the boastful missive reprinted in the UNIA journal, The New World, The Negro World. And it said, quote, "White supremacy is our slogan, And we are going to rule this country without the aid or consent of the Negro, wrote the Klan leader. As a warning for families such as the Littles, the letter continued, "We are checking up on you Negroes. Omaha comes next." UNIA leader Marcus Garvey used the Klan letter along with the 1919 Omaha riot to make his case that America would brutally defend white supremacy at all costs. The FBI killed Malcolm X. I believe it. The FBI or the CIA, to make it easy, we can just say the US government killed Malcolm X. Garvey's international group differed noticeably from its domestic rival, the strictly homegrown National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Both were non-violently opposed to racial oppression, but the NAACP was at the time predominantly white. It had been founded in 1909 in New York City with some 60 charter members, only 7 of whom were colored. The organization that Malcolm's parents joined was exclusively black, and as community activists, they focused on the domestic group tenets, counseling self-reliance, independent-mindedness, and a fierce racial pride, all dangerous pursuits for Negroes in the United States. As their family grew, Earl and Louise would insist upon fairness for their children at school, just as they demanded it for themselves in housing and elsewhere. Yeah, the evidence really does seem to suggest that. I never forget the interview that Dick Gregory did when he was talking about them getting the autopsy report from Malcolm X's body. Now, something to note is that when you see his assassination depicted in the movie by Spike Lee, it shows the black men running up on stage or running up to the stage and shooting upwards into Malcolm's body. But when they got the autopsy report, they noted that all the bullets that were going into Malcolm's body were coming in at a downward angle. That means the people on the floor didn't have real bullets, but the shots were coming up from above, from the balcony area. So what does that tell you? To me, that says they wanted those black men to be the scapegoats while the government got away with actually pulling off the assassination. It's that idea of throwing a rock and hiding your hand. Let's see, where were you? Okay, again and again, they would pay a terrible price for their stance. Even before the Klan horsemen rode up to their door on the outskirts of Omaha in the spring of 1925, a white delegation had paid Earl's bosses a visit at the meatpacking plant where he earned his living. They demanded that the uppity nigger be fired or else he was let go. So by the time Malcolm was born, Reverend Little was supporting his growing family with free will offerings from churches and housing repair jobs he picked up as an independent contractor. He'd drive around in the neighborhoods where he might see things that needed repair, Wilford remembered. He'd make them an offer. They agreed to it, and he'd go ahead and repair whatever it was, or he'd build an outhouse, all kinds of stuff. Such repair work fell within the skill set of Malcolm's father, who had trained as a carpenter and mason back in Georgia. Let's see. Malcolm X had some extreme beliefs, but it always struck me that he was so willing to change his mind and grow, unafraid to challenge, unafraid to challenge the status quo, even in his own institutions. Yeah, that is quite remarkable, and I think that's something else that makes Malcolm stand out as a leader, that he was willing to change his mind when he got new information. Like his mindset continued to grow. Now, there's a chapter in here, I believe, that talks about the founder of the Nation of Islam. I believe his name is Fard Muhammad. But it's going to be interesting when we get to that point. So keep checking back, when I read it online. But yeah, that I admire Malcolm X a lot because he was so fearless and he was so willing to, put it all on the line for his people. Let's see. Continuing, already some 2 generations out of slavery, when statistically they had been 3/5 of a person, Negro, excuse me, Negroes conducted an unrequited love affair with the Republic that had, reluctantly at best, freed them in 1863. They fought in U.S. wars and paid taxes. They rendered cheap labor on railroads and docks, in factories, private kitchens, and cotton fields. Although fulfilling the obligations of citizenship, Negroes were systematically denied the benefits. White supremacy was certified and enforced as national policy by the full force of the Supreme Court, Congress, and the executive branch of the federal government, although in wholly different ways. The court's 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal ruling was a sham decision that froze in place an impregnable caste structure under legalized segregation. Negroes were oppressed as a permanent underclass and were flagrantly denied equal access to housing, jobs, education, police accommodations, due process in the courts, and despite the passage of the 15th Amendment, the guaranteed right to vote. And even when American women were granted the vote in 1920, Negroes across gender lines were largely denied the franchise, especially in the South, where some 80% of them lived. Even in the nation's capital, racial segregation was the law of the land, harshly enforced by no less authority than that of the president. In addition to mandating separate and less well appointed and maintained cafeterias and toilet facilities for Negroes in federal buildings, Woodrow Wilson had allowed the Treasury Department and the Post Office to segregate black civil service employees from whites by makeshift wooden partitions. One colored postal clerk, whose duties required regular contact with whites in the office, had a cage built around him, according to a letter of complaint to President Wilson from noted scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. When, as previously mentioned, William Monroe Trotter, the editor of the widely read Negro newspaper, the Boston Guardian, took a delegation of Negro leaders to the White House to protest this segregated federal policy, President Wilson rebuffed them sharply. Quote, segregation is not humiliating, but a benefit and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen, President Wilson told the delegation from the National Independent Equal Rights League during his November 12, 1914 visit. When Trotter disputed Wilson's claim that federal employees were racially separated to avoid friction, the president, as widely reported in the New York Times and elsewhere, cited Trotter's tone and dismissed the delegation leader. So in Wilson's mind, it was like, yo, the nerve of you to be speaking to me like this. I'm the president of the United States, and you gonna know your place, boy. Mm-mm-mm. Okay, quote, your manners offends me, Wilson muttered. Despite street rallies defending Trotter, the federal government continued to segregate the races for decades. When in early 1917, the president subsequently petitioned Congress to enter the war in Europe to make the world safe for democracy, Negro leaders debated that their stance should be, excuse me, Negro leaders debated what their stance should be toward an administration that so egregiously denied them equal rights. Should they push for inclusion in American society and join the fight? After having supported Wilson's candidacy in 1912, Du Bois was appalled by the president's eager collaboration with racist Southern legislators. However, just as abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass had argued for blacks to fight during the Civil War, Du Bois urged them to join the ranks of Wilson's racially segregated army and drew sharp personal criticism for his support. And you know what? I can understand that. Why should I go and fight for a country, excuse me, that's treating me the way that it's treating me? If I'm a second class citizen, what's the point of me fighting for the rights and safety of people overseas in Europe? White military officers, however, were reluctant to field armed black GIs against the European soldiers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the other Central Powers. The Marines strongly opposed accepting Negro volunteers, and those the Navy accepted were restricted to non-combatant menial posts as stewards or mess hall workers. Still, some 2.3 million Negroes registered for the draft, with 370,000 inducted into the military. And despite heavy resistance from white officers and fellow soldiers, Negroes performed acts of battlefield valor that went largely unnoticed. Not until 73 years later, when the government review disclosed strong racial bias in the Army, would America award a Medal of Honor to a black combatant from World War I. In the 1991 White House ceremony, President George H.W. Bush presented the honor to the sister of Corporal Freddie Stowers, who had been recommended for it shortly after he died from wounds suffered when he led an assault on fortified German trenches. So think about this as this idea of white supremacy. They were so they were so in love with the idea of white supremacy that this idea of giving black soldiers guns to fight against their enemy, other white enemies, they didn't like that idea. There's like, you know what? We don't like those Germans, those Austrian Hungaries over there, but I don't know if it's a good idea to give black people in our army guns to shoot them. Probably gives them a bad idea. So, we're coming up on an hour of reading. So we're going to stop right there. We made it to chapter 2, Storms of Racism. You guys check back on my channel, and I'll put the rest of this chapter up. This is fascinating so far. And again, this is all information that we need to have so we can see just what kind of country that we're living in and how history really hasn't changed that much. We have to be aware of these things so when we can see it happening, again, we just have a better idea of what people are capable of and what we need to do to protect ourselves. So again, if we were reading from The Dead or Rising, the Life of Malcolm X, thank y'all for tuning in. I'll see y'all on the next episode of Ron's Library and Ideas. Peace.